my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I am going to be doing two wrap-ups in one. These are the books that I read in September and October because I am currently very behind. First, I will be starting off with my statistics for September, and then I will move on to the books that I read in September. After that, we will go over the October statistics and my October reads. So starting off with September, I read 9 books. Of those 9 books, the author backgrounds included 6 authors of white or Caucasian backgrounds, 1 of Swana origins, and 2 from indigenous communities, the specific communities being the Potawatomi and Ojibwe. I unfortunately read all of these books in audio format. I am a little bit sad about this because I have been trying to read less audiobooks. I was doing a pretty good job of that over the summer, but in September, the school year restarted for me and I have been reading so many essays, and on top of that, other materials and, other tasks that we have as teachers. So I think that my eyes just kind of needed a break when it came to reading for fun. Now let's move on to the countries that I read from. This month was entirely Western centric, and the countries read from were Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Belgium. My average rating for this month was a 3.7 stars, and I have kind of been stuck in this range of 3.5 to 3.7. Overall though, for September, I actually feel like I read a lot of books that I really enjoyed. So part of me was a little surprised that the rating was still kind of falling in this range. But looking back at these books in more detail to prepare to discuss them and share my thoughts, I realized that there were some that, they were a little bit problematic, and that contributes to the ratings for sure. So now on to what I actually read in September. I started the month by continuing on with Holly Jackson's A Good Girl's Guide to Murder series. I started the second book, and this was the first one in the series that I read on audio, and I am really glad that I did that because I greatly enjoyed the audiobook narration for this. This installment has some aspects that are like a podcast and some more the traditional narrative that we see with Pip's perspective in the first book. I am obviously not going to go into too much detail about the events that happen in this book, but it is another mystery for Pip to solve. I found this one to be a little less engaging than the first book. I think that this one had a much more slower moving investigation, so that contributed to this kind of meh feeling that I had for most of the book. It only changed in the last 30%. The last 30% has major revelations that I thought were very well crafted, and I think the author planted seeds of these revelations earlier on that, looking back, you can very clearly see how this happened, but it wasn't super apparent at the time, obviously, that you're reading it. Holly Jackson has such a knack for these big plot twists, and I really enjoy the fact that I do feel surprised by her books and they do really feel like thrillers. However, one of her weakest points for me is the characters. That became really obvious in this installment because there is this kind of change starting to happen with Pip, but it doesn't feel very natural or authentic in the way it's expressed through the story. It's mainly conveyed through conversations, and that is a little bit frustrating to me because I think we could have gotten a lot more from Pip and other characters that we are seeing all over again and seeing kind of like the ripple effects of the first book in. It just felt underutilized in this story in terms of really pushing this to be a much more emotionally impactful read. Overall, that did really impact my reading experience with this, and so I landed on a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book was also a continuation of a series and actually a conclusion of the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. I read The Last Olympian by Riordan, and this book is complicated because on the one hand, there is never going to be a perfect ending to an epic series like this, yet there are really epic moments in this that were amazing. Riordan does an amazing job of tying up some of the unanswered, long-standing questions that plague many parts of this series. I really liked the redemption arc that we get of certain characters, and there is a new character who was introduced in the 4th book who I really feared was kind of just being used as a plot device. But in this book, there is a grander story and character arc that I did not expect and I thought was incredibly well done. However, the big battle that we have kind of been building up to over the course of the books was pretty meh for me, and I think there were some lackluster elements in keeping the right momentum for certain parts of the story, so I landed on this one at a 4 stars. However, I'm still really glad to have finished this series, and I'm really happy that I made note of my thoughts this time because the first time I read this series, I read part of it with my nephew and I didn't keep track of anything related to reading at that time, so it was really lovely to go back through these, and some parts I remembered, some parts I really did not. Yeah, there was just a lot of nostalgia with this, and I am reminded why Riordan is such a beloved author. The next book that I read was one that is much beloved, and I really do not understand why. I really just liked this book, and it is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. I rated this 2.5 stars. Although I find this book interesting, it is a nonfiction book that is about this really tragic series of murders that happen in a Native American community. The first part is about the actual original murders and the family that it affects. The second part is about an investigation that later happens. And the final part is, I believe, supposed to be like semi-autobiographical, because it's, as far as I can tell, David Grann, his experience like going to this community and trying to uncover like what happened as a journalist. The first two parts had interesting elements. However, there was a lot of overlap between them, a lot of things that were being repeated constantly. I found the third part of the book actually gave me quite an ick, because I think that David Grann believes that he is like the most fascinating person, and his writing style was just weird. Yeah, I just didn't like this. I really didn't like the writing style throughout, because I think that this falls into a category of sensationalizing violence and crime, and I really don't like that type of writing style. So yeah, I really don't understand why this one is much beloved, and this has really turned me off of reading anything by David Grann. After David Grann, I read a book that brought me so much joy, and that is The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is my second of Kimmerer's books, and this one has a lot of overlap with the first one I've read of hers, which is Braiding Sweetgrass. This is all about abundance and reciprocity, cultures, and how we need these to help us move through these times of life. I mean, she doesn't really get into specifics, but I think that it's more hinting at like the socio-political struggles that we're seeing unfold in today's world. This type of culture and this type of care and community is something so healing and something that we need to lean into now more than ever. It's a very short collection of essays, and I understand that some of them may feel very repetitive, but I really love Robin Wall Kimmerer's writing style. Everything she writes is just so fascinating to me. So this might be a personal bias on my end, but yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read, I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about, because it was a book club book that kind of broke my brain when I finished reading it, and that is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. This is translated from French by Schwartz, and this is a dystopian about a woman who is imprisoned. The only other prisoners are women, and they all had lives before they were in prison, but this woman does not. She remains unnamed throughout the book. Everyone else has all these memories of life before, and they don't understand why they're there. They don't know how they got there. And so they're in this prison, and then one day something happens, and then they start exploring from there. This is a really haunting story. There's a lot of inner reflection in this on the ways that you build community, what the meaning of life is life meaningful if there are no personal relationships, familial relationships. There's a lot in this about religion, about care and love, support, and all of these different things. And yeah, this is a book that when I finished it, I truly had to sit in silence for a while, because I found it to be so incredibly depressing. And understanding more about the author's background, her and her family fled from the Nazis during World War II, and she expresses in the afterword, I actually don't remember if it was the author or if it's the translator in the afterword who has a section about like how this author had, I don't want to say a fascination, but more a bewilderment in trying to understand how the Holocaust could happen and what conditions allowed for this to happen. And I think that you can see that reflected a lot in this book. These kinds of big questions, both morally, religiously, I mean, it's just a book with so much symbolism behind it, and it's left me very confused about my thoughts on it. Frequently before reading this, heard people say they either loved it or hated it, and I definitely get that now, because this is a book that is going to appeal to certain people, and for other people I think it's a really scary and dark look at life that maybe people won't feel comfortable with, or they won't understand like what was the point to all of this. I can say that it's a book I would recommend to people. It's definitely a conversation starter for sure though. But anyway, now on to the next book, which was my favorite book of the month, and that is Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. I loved this book. The writing in this was absolutely amazing. This one really shocked me because I recently had been falling into a bit of a slump with young adult books where I felt like maybe I'm at an age where I am not the intended audience for this, and now I can understand why. But this book really reminded me that there are some YA books that really transcend this specific audience label, and I really, really enjoyed this one. This is the story of a young woman named Donis who has just finished her senior year and is spending the summer after her senior year trying to figure out if she's going to go to college or not. Then something happens and this changes the course of her life, and she starts to discover that there is something really dark happening in her hometown. This is a book that I really hope becomes a TV series because I could so vividly picture this book in my mind, and it is like perfect pacing for that type of adaptation. Not only is this a actual thriller, like there are parts of this story that were genuinely scary, it has a tension to it, but also this is a really deep reflection on our main character, and there is so much growth and development that happens of her throughout this book. I think that also there's a beautiful sub-story here of the culture and community that she's raised in and her struggles to identify with this as a mixed race Indigenous woman, the kind of community that surrounds her and their like thoughts on this, and also on the struggles that they're facing and how they view outsiders and how they even view people within their own community. There's a lot of love and care that you can tell Angeline Boulley put into this story. I think that I learned so much from reading this book. It was just a really amazing read. I am so kicking myself because a few years ago, this author actually did a talk at a university that I worked for, and I put off reading the book because I heard a lot of people say that it was a very slow read, and I now wish so desperately that I had gone to that talk because I would love to hear more of this author's thoughts and opinions and work. I've watched a few YouTube videos where she talks about her writing process for this book, and so that will, I guess, hold me over until hopefully she does another event in a part of the world where I live. After The Firekeeper's Daughter, I started another Riordan series, and this is The Lost Hero, the first book in the Heroes of Olympus series. I had no clue what this one was about, except that it incorporates Roman mythology, and I was really happy that this one, although we still have the characters from the Percy Jackson series, there's a whole new set of characters that are being introduced to us. Not only is this one a definite jump from middle grade to young adult, but also the characters are really focused in this first book. I felt like the majority of the story was character work and development, and I really appreciated that because there are definitely times in the Percy Jackson books where that is missing or put on the back burner, and it felt the exact opposite here, which I am really intrigued about how that will play out in the later books, because this first book really felt like it was just setting up the basics of the foundations of stories that we're gonna, obviously learn more about as we go along. But I do think that the plot was still intriguing in this, and the ending left me eager to see what was gonna happen in the next book. So I gave that one 4 out of 5 stars, and on a similar vein, I apparently could not stop starting series in the month of September because I then started the Murderbot Diary series. So I read All Systems Red by Martha Wells. I didn't know anything about this book except that people were really excited for the TV show to come out, because I believe Alexander Skarsgård is Murderbot. I'm definitely now looking forward to watching the series because I really enjoyed this first book. It is the story of a Murderbot. It is like a security robot that goes on these missions with people, and this Murderbot is unique because it overrode its controls and now just wants to like sit around and watch reality television or dramas. It's on this trip with these scientists. Something happens, it kind of spirals out from there. This is a short book. I mean, they're novellas really, and I thought that it was really well done. This story is pretty simple, but I enjoyed the characters, and I really liked Murderbot's narration. The story that was unfolding was interesting enough, like it kept me engaged. So I am looking forward to continuing on. So another 4-star read for me. Then I ended the month of September with another book that I would definitely consider a contender for my favorites, and that is You Started It by Khalilieh. This was a young adult book that I was initially very nervous about because I read this author's debut book, I think in 2023 or 2024, called Something More, and I liked it, but it was definitely younger end of YA, and this was actually the exact opposite. This was the upper end of YA, and I think that there is a real maturity in this author's writing, storytelling, and character development in this book that I was really happy to see. This was a fun story, but it also has some really serious elements that I think were really well done for the intended audience, and also something that was really interesting for me as an older reader. This is the story of a girl who had her senior year all planned out with her boyfriend. They had this bucket list of things to do, and then the day before her senior year starts, her boyfriend breaks up with her. She is devastated and turns to this guy in her high school who is this like famous TikTok star. So they start to fake date in order to make her ex-boyfriend jealous, and shenanigans ensue from there. I loved both of the main characters in this. There's a real depth to them, and I really liked the ways that they felt very distinct from one another and very nuanced. I loved the dynamic between them. There's a lot of banter. There were times in this book where I was literally giddy. I was like, oh, I just love reading about this experience of these kids who are just having a bit of fun after so much serious stuff has happened. And something that I found that was especially well done in this is the experience of our main female character, Jamie, getting over her breakup, experiencing all the complex emotions of a breakup with someone that you've been with for a very long time, you pictured a very specific life with, and that not going to plan. I think that that is something that was explored as its own grieving process throughout the book. And I appreciated that this was something the author shows in waves and not just 5 minutes of sadness and now on to the next thing. I was really happy to have given this one a chance because it really impressed me. I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm really hoping that this author will put out another book soon because I think that she's only going to go up from here. Now let's get into the books that I read in October. October was a slightly smaller reading month for me. I finished 8 books. Of those 8 books, the format that I read them in, 4 of them were audiobooks and 2 of them were ebooks. So still a bit of an imbalance here. Another imbalance that I didn't realize until the end of the month was that 5 of the authors I read from were white authors, and 1 I have to categorize as various because it was an anthology where there were authors from all kinds of different backgrounds. But yeah, that was a little bit of a shock to me because I think that this was a month where I really was not reading a wide variety of books, and it was most obvious in those statistics. On top of that, I only read from 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So definitely room for improvement this month. My average rating for the month was a 3.5 yet again. That is not unexpected by this point. So I started the month out yet again with another Holly Jackson book. I finally finished the Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy, and I gave the final book a 3.5 stars. I felt very conflicted by this one because on the one hand, there is an absolutely epic plot twist that is in this book. Like, I truly could not believe the way that Holly Jackson had crafted this big reveal. Truly jaw-dropping. I had to stop the book and like pace around my apartment when I got to the main reveal of this because I could not have believed it. However, once again, there were pacing issues in this book. I think that the pacing issues were not as bad as the second book. Something that was worse than the second book was the character development. It was non-existent in this installment, and it took a very long time for me to kind of get over this because there's something very major that is happening with Pip throughout the majority of this book. And there are like no other characters that have any meaningful interaction with Pip for a very long time in this book. And that was something very frustrating to me because in the first book, we see this character development of Pip in relation to her love of her friends and her family, and that just kind of gets completely lost in the sauce in this series, and it's very annoying at a certain point because no one is being developed. There's like no growth in this book. And then the second half of the book was actually much weaker than the first half and really falls into this repetitive, oddly paced narrative. I was a little bit let down by the series because I didn't feel like there was ever anything that lived up to the first book for me. However, I can understand why this is a really beloved series in terms of a young adult audience who may not care as much about character development or certain aspects like that because they're much more invested in the actual story. But I kind of want a little bit more if the story is falling into a repetitive pattern, which is what I felt was happening by this point. Now, leaving my negative energy behind with As Good as Dead, I then picked up The People's Project, which is an anthology edited by Saaed Jones and Maggie Smith. This is one I gave 4 stars. This is a collection of various different poems, essays, even some visual art pieces, which is kind of asking the reader this vital question of what can we hold on to when our government no longer seems to serve us. This was just such a beautiful collection and a reminder of like why it is so important to celebrate community, hold on to hope, keep talking to people, keep holding faith, because we can't just wallow in despair all the time, even though that is sometimes a little bit easier. Such an amazing collection of voices. Some of my favorites from this included pieces by Alexander Chee, Joy Harjo, Chase Strangio, Jill Damatak, Kesey Lehman, Saaed Jones, Alice Wong, Abby Maxwell, Marlon James, and Kay Jones. There's many more people beyond that, but those were just some of my favorite pieces, and I really applaud the wide variety of voices that they got to come together to make this collection because there were some really unique pieces in here of all different types of art forms that I really appreciated. And I think that this one is really a necessary read for the times that we're living in right now, so I hope that more people will pick that one up. After that, I was on a pretty good reading streak and I picked up my favorite book of the month, which was Slewfoot by Brom. I did not expect to love this book as much as I did because I am someone who really struggles with books that feel a little bit fairy tale-esque, and this book definitely falls into that, but I think this one almost reminded me of reading like The Crucible. There's just like this dark, immersive atmosphere to this story. It really does feel like you are in the time period that is being discussed and written about. This is set in Puritan community where there is a young woman named Abatha who is married and her husband is kind of a pushover. They're experiencing financial problems. Her brother-in-law is kind of threatening to basically hold their farm as leverage for his own debt. She has to find a way to basically like pay him back. There is then the character of Slewfoot, who we're introduced to as another main character that we follow along with, and his path becomes intertwined with Abatha's at a certain point. This is a book that is exploring a lot of different themes. Most of them are circulating around power, religion, the role of women, things like this. This is a book that I think would be very interesting to read for like a course on literature inspired by the Puritan era, because wow, it was just so fascinating to read this book. And it definitely eventually turns into a gory horror novel. I'm not gonna like sugarcoat it. I won't say that this book is appropriate for like all readers or something like that, but I didn't even care that there was gore in this, because I first of all didn't think that it was like gore just for gore's sake. But this is really a story of female rage. Even when it leans into horror, I think that it's almost like cathartic. Like you are satisfied with this as the reader. At least I was, because I think it's entirely justified in how this story plays out. I really love this one. I have actually gotten 2 of my friends to read it since, and it was just the perfect Halloween read. After that one, I went back to a book that I soft DNF'd in February because I was not in the right headspace to read this, and it was Swift and Saddled by Lyla Sage. I am really glad that I returned to this when I did, because I really enjoyed this. This is the second book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series, and this one follows Ada and Wes. I do feel like this leans a little bit into the cringe and insta-lovey vibes, but I really liked Wes in this. I think that he's an endearing character. There's real depth and emotion behind Wes, and I thought that that was really nicely balanced with Ada, who is on a journey of growth on her own, but she's a little bit more all over the place, and I think that it was balanced out very well between them. And I really liked seeing Ada grow into her own in this and find her own way. That was also a really important part of this story. In this one, it was much more about individually realizing your dreams and how they can work collaboratively together, even if you're not always in the same place. And I really loved that aspect to this one. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Garbage Poems by Anna Swanson. This is a poetry collection that is quite an unusual concept, because it's all from trash that was gathered from local swimming spots that the author went to and transformed into art. These are quite literally garbage poems. They are coming from garbage pieces that she collected. And I really liked that concept, and I think that it is pretty well done here. This is really examining what defines something as garbage, how does waste nowadays really shape our world, and what does it reveal about us that these are the things that we throw away. There were some poems in this that I really enjoyed and I thought were well done. There were some poems that I couldn't really connect to, and so I think that that kind of led to this imbalance for me. Overall, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, and I think if you are someone who enjoys environmental poetry, this will really be your speed. I can see this being something that a lot of different audiences would really enjoy, and maybe even more so than I did. After that one, I read a cozy sci-fi, and that was Automatic Noodle by Annalee Newitz. This book was pretty hyped, and I was seeing a lot of mixed reviews about it, and I understand why, because this is a very charming story. It's about a group of robots who there has been this war in the United States, and California is now its own country, and these robots are like given full rights as citizens in some cases. This was like the major split between the United States and California, and so there's this group of robots who are opening a restaurant and trying to succeed, even though there's like kind of a prejudice against robots in this new California. This was a really intriguing concept. The world is something that I was continuously fascinated by, because we don't really get the full story of what happened. We get these glimpses. I loved the characters in this. I thought that they were really endearing, and I found myself really loving the interactions that they have with other people and other robots as well. However, it's a novella. It's very short. It's something that made it hard at times, because there is a plot in this, and I think it is interesting, but it needed more time and space, as did the characters at certain points, and that just wasn't there. I really hope that this author will return to this series and expand on it in later books, but I think that this is really a novella that should have been a full-length book, and it makes me a little sad that it is contained to a novella form, because there's a really great story here that just isn't given enough space to really bloom into a masterpiece that I think it could have been. So I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. I read this one on audiobook, and I would recommend that because the voices were very entertaining. Then to end October, I had some seasonal reads that I was hoping would, kind of bring in the atmosphere of the spooky season. And the first one was Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. I don't want to say it's a retelling of Frankenstein because like it partially is, but it's also not. We follow this young woman, Mary. She is a descendant of Victor Frankenstein, eventually finds out about his experiments and decides to try to kind of recreate them. However, that doesn't really happen for most of the book. I would say largely 70% of this book is just exposition. It is just like the daily events in her life, and it was so boring. I really struggled with this because this is kind of exploring some themes of the original Frankenstein and then also adding in queer elements that I thought were intriguing. However, they never really lead to anything, and that was kind of what this book felt like as a whole. There's a lot going on that doesn't lead to anything substantial. I asked myself, like, what was the point of all of this? There's like bits and pieces I enjoyed. In the beginning of the book, it is very atmospheric and you do really feel like the spooky season vibes, and that is replicated in certain parts as well, but overall it was just meh. So I just don't think it was very well done. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The more I think about this book though, the less I like it, so I may take that down to 2.5 stars because yeah, it just was not a great read. And then the last book kind of also fell into this category. This was another retelling. It's Not Quite a Ghost by Ursu. I was so excited for this because this is a middle grade retelling of The Yellow Wallpaper. Yet I think that this being pitched as a retelling is not great because I think the author kind of forgot that that was like the whole point of the book, because that is like forgotten for most of this story. I even forgot at a certain point that this was a Yellow Wallpaper retelling. The majority of the story is actually focused on this young girl who, her and her family moved into this house, and there's a lot of change happening in her life, and she is starting to kind of evaluate her friendships because something happens to her. The heart of this book is really its representation of chronic illness, and I think that this is a really good book for middle grade audiences in that regard because it absolutely has such an amazing representation of family that support you and believe you and validate your experiences, and I think that that's so important for children to have representation of. I don't think it's a great retelling of The Yellow Wallpaper. I give it 3 stars, and it's one that I still think middle grade readers should read because I think it still has important things being discussed. But yeah, that was a really sad end to my spooky reading month. So something I learned from this is that I maybe am not good at picking seasonal reads, because in October I was finally reading books for the first time possibly in the correct season. It feels like when I try to pick books based on the season that they should be read in, I don't enjoy them that much, or it's a very hit or miss situation. When I read them out of the season, I typically enjoy them more. So maybe that was my problem. But yeah, overall, I still enjoyed this reading month. I think I read from such a wide variety of genres that it was really nice because I never felt like I was reading similar stories. I felt, genuinely interested in many of the books that I read because a lot of them are books that had been on my TBR for a while. So overall, very happy with this month's reading. I think September was better in terms of the quality of the books that I was reading that month. But nevertheless, it feels insane to say that I read 17 books over 2 months because I really thought that come September and October, I wouldn't be reading like anything at all. Very thankful for the books that I was able to complete. And if you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I would also like to know what you were reading during the spooky season. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Happy reading. Bye.